Soft match filtering and uniquely identifying users. When you perform a synchronization with the Azure AD Connect tool, it will attempt to detect whether the on-premise user already exists in the Azure AD tenant, and this can be done either with a soft match or with a hard match. With the soft match, it will compare the primary email addresses to see if there's a match between the two environments. If there is, it'll assume that they're the same user or contact. After all, no two users in the world should share the same duplicate email addresses, right? For on-prem, the primary email address can be either the mail attribute or one of the addresses in proxy addresses with the uppercase SMTP. They should be the same anyway, and they should stay synced. For Azure, however, there is no mail attribute, so it matches to the primary address in proxy addresses. Remember that the order doesn't matter, the primary is the one with the uppercase SMTP. If it detects a match, it will convert the object GUID from the on-premise environment into a base 64 string and save it to the immutable ID field in Azure AD. It will then update all the cloud user's other attributes with the value from the on-prem user. Once matched, it'll no longer need the mail property to associate the two users. The object GUID and the immutable ID are what now is linked through the sync server. You could freely change the primary email and the changes would flow through to the Office 365 user, assuming of course that the email has a verified domain in Office 365 and that it's not a duplicate. The reason Microsoft uses the object GUID as the linking attribute after the initial association is because it should never change over the life of the object. The exception is if you're moving a user between forests. When you move a user between forests, you're not actually moving it. You're creating a new user and copying all the data. That new user creation actually generates a new object GUID. So if you plan to move users around between forests, then you have the option of picking an attribute other than the object GUID as the source anchor, which is what it's called in directory synchronization. But 99% of the time, the object GUID is what you should use. If you don't want to use the object GUID, then it's up to you to pick an attribute that you know will be valid, unique, and never change. And this could be an employee ID number or some other custom attribute. But then it's up to you to make sure that this value is always accurate. And if it's written by an application, well, now you need to know that you're creating a dependency where Office 365 directory synchronization depends on that application properly writing those attributes. One wrong move by the app, and all the users get moved or soft deleted, and now nobody can log in or access email. So be very careful if you decide to change the source anchor. So the recommendation is to use object GUID. And if you plan to move users for a migration or some big one-time event, then you could plan how to handle this at the time, and there's also ways to do it. Only consider using a different attribute if moving users between forests is standard practice and you're sure that you can use another attribute that never changes. Now, there are situations where the email address configured in Office 365 might not match the email address on-premise. For example, if you're planning on using a new domain when you move to Office 365, you may have users configured with different email addresses on-prem and in the cloud. But maybe in preparation for synchronization, you've made the user's on-premise UPN match the Office 365 UPN. So we can use a function called soft match on UPN. Now, this will always be a fallback to primary email. You can't have it check UPN first, but assuming your users have either the same email or UPN, they will be matched up properly. By the way, when this matching happens, many of the properties of the Office 365 user can no longer be manually edited, at least not through the GUI anyway. If you were able to make edits, then they would just be overwritten on the next synchronization anyway from the on-premise environment, which is now said to be the authority. So if you already have an Office 365 user, and then you begin synchronization from an on-premise environment, it's called transferring authority because it's no longer considered a cloud-managed user, it's now a synchronized from AD user. And this ability to use UPN as a secondary match criteria can be set with the PowerShell command using the set-msol dir sync feature enable soft match on UPN -enable $true. And we'll look more at this command in one of the future demos. And this feature used to be off by default, but as of March 2016, all new sync users will automatically have this feature enabled, and you have to turn it off if you don't want it. So now that we know about soft matching, well, what about hard matching? Well, to hard match your user, you would manually copy the values of the object GUID or whatever attribute you chose to use as the source anchor, into the immutable ID property of the Office 365 user ahead of the synchronization. The soft match is only performed in order to determine which of the two users to associate. By manually inserting the on-premise source anchor into the Azure immutable ID, you are doing the association yourself. The tricky part here is that the object GUID and the immutable ID are in different formats. The object GUID is a GUID type, which includes specially formatted hexadecimal values. The immutable ID uses a base 64 string, so you'll need to perform a conversion to make this work. It's not too difficult, but it's not covered in this course. When we look at the properties of the users, we'll see what each of these formats look like. If you've been around for a while and you've ever seen MIME-encoded attachments, then you know what base 64 looks like. It's mostly made up of characters on the keyboard, not some of the other special characters that are difficult to identify. But you really shouldn't need to perform hard matching in most situations. The soft matching works pretty well as long as your users have the correct identification on both sides. Next, we'll look at how to uniquely ID users in your on-premise environment. As we spoke about in the topology lesson, there are times when you may have duplicate identities in your on-premise multi-forest environments. Sometimes they're a combination of users and contacts, and sometimes they're duplicated user accounts, like in a linked mailbox scenario where one user is disabled in the resource forest and the other is enabled in the account forest. So when the sync server attempts to update or copy values from the incoming connector spaces to that single user object in the metaverse, it needs a way to associate these on-premise identities together, and it does so using attribute values. If all the users and contacts across all forests are unique, and there's no merging or syncing needed between identities, well, then there's no need to pick an attribute to uniquely identify these users. But if you have some people who are users in one forest, but appear as contacts in other forests in order to maintain full global address lists across the entire organization, well, then it's safe to assume that the users and the contacts all have the same mail attribute. In this case, you could specify to use the mail attribute to identify these identities across all forests. This way, only one object will be updated in the metaverse when a synchronization is performed, and you won't wind up with multiple users and contacts in Office 365. If you're using linked mailboxes, then Exchange will set the MS Exchange Master Account SID attribute of the disabled account in the resource forest equal to the object SID of the user account in the account forest. And this is so that they can be easily associated with each other. This works out for us because we can do the same and specify that these two attributes are the ones we want to use to uniquely identify a single user. And not shown here, but you're welcome to pick your own attributes to sync as well. So here is the screen in the installation wizard where we define some of these settings. The first section allows us to set the uniquely identifying attribute for our on-premise environment, as we just spoke about. As you can see, it defaults to all users being unique, meaning there's no need to compare attributes of different users and contacts in our on-premise environment, even across forests. Or we can pick to use the mail attribute or some predefined combination of attributes for well-known account resource scenarios like linked mailboxes. But we can also pick a custom attribute if we want. The bottom section lets us pick the source anchor, and this is the attribute that will be copied into the immutable ID field in Azure, and it'll be used to always associate the on-premise user with the cloud user after the initial association. Once again, it's expected that this value in the on-premise environment will never change. As mentioned, it's best practices to leave this as the object GUID unless there's a high risk of moving users around between forests. If there's a single event coming up like a one-time migration, then we can take precautions like disabling synchronization temporarily, and then manually updating the immutable IDs of the cloud users after the migration. But we should still use object GUID as the source anchor in this situation. Only if it's common to move users around between forests should changing this be considered. So there's no demo for this lesson. Most of this will be demonstrated once we install the sync server, after which we'll go over all this again. Next up, attributes to sync.